Chapter 6. The Pilgrimage. Friday, December 14, 1877, was the day of standing to Arafat. The pilgrimage coming off on Friday is called the Greater Pilgrimage and is attended by far greater numbers than in an ordinary year. On December 13, all the gathering of nations, which had hitherto loaded almost to bursting the small valley of Mecca, was shot out, discharged. I can give no better idea. In 24 hours this army of 200,000 strong, everyone his own general, everyone his own commissary, evacuated Mecca almost to a man, marched about 11 miles east, and camped on the plain of Arafat, near Mount Arafat. This march must at least have been confused, but with every man doing his worst to make a rout of it, for it is intended to be figurative of Mohammed's flight from Mecca. Confusion was no name for it. Our preparations had as usual been of the most casual and desultory character. The camels were at the door shortly after morning prayer, yet it was 11 o'clock before the tents, baggage, and provisions could be hurry-scurried together onto their backs. Some of the most important articles had been forgotten, such as water bottles, new pilgrims' garbs, etc., which had to be purchased at the last moment. The pilgrims' garbs in which we had made our first entry into Mecca had been mere lengths of calico. We now found there was a fashionable pilgrim's garb, this being nothing more or less than a couple of rough bath towels. We mounted the camels at the door, and it took us 2 hours to get over the first mile through the streets, so closely were they thronged with camels. Sometimes the shugduffs would get entangled and be torn nearly off. The inmates, if women, would scream and pray, if men, curse and pray, notwithstanding the guard which they are supposed to keep over their tongues on this so solemn an occasion, and predominant over all rose the oft-repeated shrill labbaques, to which I added my quota of discordance, entering into the thing gleefully. In the narrow streets, the shugduffs would get jammed together, and no advance could be made for some minutes, but as the crush all tended in one direction, we were at last carried out of the town into the open roads, and passed on with the current, one continuous stream of men and animals flowing out of Mecca towards Mina, a village some 5 miles east of Mecca, at which we arrived about 3 p.m. 2 rooms had been engaged for us on the ground floor of a house near the middle of the village, facing the main road, passing through it to Arafat, and here we put up for the night. The road towards Mina had been a gradual ascent. We passed over 1 or 2 stone viaducts and some cuttings between the hills. Altogether it was the best attempt at a made road I saw in the country. We also met with 1 or 2 reservoirs well supplied with water. The village of Mina lies in a pass rather than a valley, some 200 or 300 yards across and half a mile long, between 2 abrupt rocky ridges, about 200 or 300 feet in height. A good many low houses are built along the pass at the sides of the Arafat road, which is about 80 feet wide. All along this street rows of provision, tea, or tobacco stalls had been set up, and the place for the time had become a fair. In one of the windows of our room I took up my post to watch the crowds passing in their uniform white dresses, for although the women do not wear the pilgrim's garb, they must dress in white. I had not been looking out long when I became aware from the greater commotion and a general pressing from the middle of the street that something was going to happen, so I inquired from the keeper of a date stall outside the window, and was told the Sherif was coming, and in a minute or 2 the head of the procession appeared. As nearly as I can remember it passed my window in the following order. First came the Sherif's vanguard, about 100 bare-backed camels, each ridden by 2 armed Bedouin, a spearman in front and a matchlockman behind, the choicest collection of Badawi rags and filth I ever had the pleasure of contemplating. Their animals were huddled together like a flock of sheep, filling up the whole street, forcing the crowds before them and into the shops and stalls. Though the ragamuffins exerted themselves madly, and appeared to be riding furiously, they made little headway, their very hurry and confusion retarding their advance. I never saw a more barbarous, savage exhibition than these excited, ferocious-looking warriors, with their long matted locks and the 25-foot spears surmounted with tufts of ostrich feathers, which some of them carried. In rear of these mingled with and close behind came other camel riders, playing on reed instruments like short flageolets, keeping very good time and producing much noise. The music was in keeping with time and place, and was not at all bad to listen to, an Irish Keane played merrily on half a dozen Highland pipes would perhaps be as much like the Sharif's band as anything. After them followed a led camel in crimson cloth and gold ornaments, said to be carrying something belonging to the Kaaba. What was visible was a piano-e case-shaped structure about 4 feet high, covered with red cloth, and a lot of bells hanging on its front side which made a great jangling at every step of the camel. Behind this followed a rabble of armed functionaries on foot, carrying breech-loading and revolving guns and rifles, spears, swords, and anything to kill with, from a derringer to a battle-axe. After these came 12 led horses in gold and silver trappings following one another in line, light bays and chestnuts in rather too good condition for work, but compact, muscular, pretty little animals, each one handsomer than the last, and if they had gone on following one another all day, you could not have taken your eyes off. Then came the Sheriff himself, riding an iron-grey horse somewhat higher than the led ones, with exceedingly slight limbs and neck, giving the idea of light weight and great speed, but pacing quietly and unconcernedly through the mob without as much as turning its lovely little head. The wonderful docility of these evidently high-mettled animals was good to look at. The Sharif's horse was the model of them all. It seemed to be diligently persevering to carry its burden easily and not to have a look or thought for any other object. The Sheriff himself was dressed in the costume of a Badawi sheikh, light blue mantle * worked in gold about the shoulders and collar, fastened in front with a thick gold cord and tassels, on his head the ordinary silk head-dress of the Badawi, kept on by a camel's wool ring round the top of the head. He is a slight, wiry, well-made man, below the medium height. His complexion would be considered very dark even for a Badawi, almost black. He has a small round bullet head, and that peculiar cast of countenance which provokes you to say he has a face like a monkey, notwithstanding his very shrewd intelligent expression. His beard and moustache are short and scrubby, and I should guess him at under 40 years of age. His years, however, are hard to judge, and he might be any age from 24 to 40, or older if he uses hair restorer, as is the custom of many Meccans. I have only one little matter to add. The High Sherdf, the first Mohammedan in the world, was mounted in an English saddle, doing the great pilgrimage in the pig's skin, happy and unconscious. The soul of that porker, wherever it is, must be grunting triumphant hallelujahs. It does not require a profound knowledge of the East to appreciate the awful portent to Mohammedanism in this. At distances of about 20 yards respectively followed his nephews or sons. I was differently informed. The elder came first, a rather good-looking, bamboo-complexioned youth about 14, and after him the younger, evidently a brother of the first, about 8 years old. Both were mounted on chestnut horses, and dressed like the Sherif. At this part of the procession were a great number of followers, bearers of wands and insignia of office, mounted and foot-armed attendants, some in pilgrim's garb and some in ordinary gala dress. At a distance of some 50 yards behind these rode a number of Turkish officers in uniform clearing the way for the Pasha, the Sherif taking precedence of him, I believe, in consideration of the religious nature of the ceremony. A line of Mamelukes, all Turkish horse soldiers are called Mamelukes in the Hijaz, in uniform, armed with sabres and Winchester repeating carbines, were drawn up on each side of the road. This line was kept advancing by the rearman trotting outside to the front, where he would draw up until he again became rearman. This kept a line of some 50 horses stationary on each side of the road. Between them the Pasha passed in an open carriage, which was a new shiny barouche drawn by 2 European chestnut carriage horses, with coachman and footman dressed in civilized livery, and the Pasha, a grey old gentleman, in a well-cut suit of black cloth, a spick-and-span turnout that would have shone in the park. Imagine the contrast between them and their surroundings. I had become to think of such things as belonging to another state of existence. The barouche and pair quite carried me back with a revulsion. Close after the carriage followed 2 brass 12-pounder field guns drawn by mules, and a regiment of infantry, carrying their arms sloped and bayonets fixed, all the officers being in uniform, but the privates in pilgrim's garb. This ended the procession, which encamped about a mile farther on. Then the same crowd of men and animals, with now and then detachments of Turkish troops, kept sweeping by till 2 a.m., when I lay down on my blanket in a corner of the room where the Emir and 9 or 10 more of his principal servants were sleeping. In the morning I did not get up till the stir of rolling up rugs and carpets awoke me. I found bright sunshine, and the morning prayer long over. So taken up had my companions been with peacemaking and forgiving one another all grudges, as they were to be absolved from all past sins on that day, that I had been overlooked. So I said a great many God forgive me's with all due contrition, and after my ablution and prayer, joined in the general reconciliation that was going on. We fell on one another's necks, recalled and confessed all little petty offences one to another, certain of being forgiven in tears. I at first relied on my imagination for items, but my companion soon reminded me of numbers of ways in which I had offended them unconsciously or otherwise. They seemed sincere though, and made very clean breasts of it themselves. I found where numbers of little articles had gone that I had missed from my bundle. This one had appropriated a penknife, another a pair of socks. I, of course, gave and forgave with the best grace possible. We were now supposed to be at peace with all the world of true believers, and might with clear consciences appear at Arafat. Though the crowds had been pressing past all night, their numbers did not seem in the least diminished. I remember feeling very uncomfortable on that morning, the morning of the day on which I was to acquire the honoured title of Haji, and witness a scene which it is given to few Europeans to see, probably not more than one in a generation. I felt a sort of depression, as though I required to be brought up to the sticking point. Perhaps I had not quite got over the opium. I tried to wear this off by extra exertion in assisting at loading the camels, and while passing to and fro from the house, with bundles of gear, I twice fancied a woman in the yard tried to attract my attention, and the next time I passed I heard her pronounce my name. The Lady Venus at once dawned on me. I had been living in such stirring times lately that she had quite escaped my memory, and you may be sure my peace be upon you, and God be praised, came from the bottom of my heart, when she now appeared on the scene so opportunely. She told me that she was staying in the same house as myself, with a lady friend, who was treating her to a seat on a camel for the pilgrimage. She also said the boy Abdullah had been twice to my house in Mecca to inquire for me, but had been told that I was gone to Jeddah. We had not much opportunity to talk, but I hastily got her to give me a program of the forthcoming events of the next 3 days, and we agreed to meet in the harem on that day week. Coarse remarks soon began to be made by the men standing about, and we were obliged to part quickly. About 8 a.m. our party started. In a shugduf you are so shut in by the cover that you can see little outside but your own animal's head and the preceding one's rear, so as I had been considerably freshened up by my meeting with the Lady Venus, I preferred to walk by the camels, and mingle with the throng, giving my mount to one of my companions. As we passed along the valleys between, the rocky hills became more open, and the crowds were able to disperse themselves over wider roads, so that the press was not so great as on the day before. 146. About an hour after leaving Mina, I recognized in a dead horse on the road one of the fine carriage horses I had seen the day before drawing the pasha. Its throat had been cut, as is the custom when an animal is thought to be past recovery, and though it could not have been dead more than 3 or 4 hours, its skin was fast becoming like leather, so quickly does the dry sand and air of the desert absorb moisture. The road from Mecca to Arafat cannot be more than 10 or 11 miles, yet many animals had fallen by the way. Between Mina and Arafat I counted 14 dead camels, and also saw many fresh graves of the last night, probably those of men who, having travelled thousands of miles, had died at the very threshold of their goal. The camel sheikh, who was conductor of our caravan, and from whom we had hired the camels owned by him or some of his relations, spoke a little Hindustani, a very unusual accomplishment for a Badawi. He was an exceedingly good specimen of his kind, though not by any means a fair sample of that light-hearted murderer, far too good for that. The ordinary Badawi is slightly made, wiry and short, and you may see a better leg on a crutch than his any day. This man was tall, muscular, and full-bearded, but a thorough Badawi in manner, active and seaman-like. He gave his orders to those he considered under him with all the confidence of an efficient officer, and a good deal of the hop-along air of a Yankee boatswain. So much of the nautical touch was there about him and his companions, that I at once christened him Sheikh the Boatswain, and would have quite expected to see him give his pants a hitch if he had worn what he and all Bedouin consider such a very unnecessary and effeminate article of apparel. He walked for some distance by my side, mounting his little son, about 9 years of age, on his riding camel. After bandying a few Eastern questions and compliments, he asked me for one of the cheroots I was smoking, and then went on to ask me about India, a country where he had heard the inhabitants were not quite all Mohammedans. I noticed one of the weapons in his girdle, a long straight knife which struck me as being somehow familiar, so I pointed to it, and said inquiringly, "Good?" He at once drew it, and holding it out in admiration, exclaimed, "Rogers!" Well, come, I thought, this is worse than my not knowing the Lady Venus, an unmistakable large Rogers carving knife, clean and bright, calling to mind more than one cut off a ham. "Rogers!" I said. "Where's Rogers?" He was astonished at my ignorance. "Did not I know a Rogers blade when I saw it?" And he pointed out the mystic characters, and explained that all knives with that mark were, and here he gave the steel point a significant spring with his finger and thumb, and went through the motions of cutting a throat with, "In the name of God." God is great, I an infidel. I did not care to continue the subject. A Rogers blade in the Hijaz I afterwards found need not necessarily have been made by Rogers, but any blade with English characters on it, or even a native-made blade of well-proved metal obtains that name, the word having been generally adopted as a synonym for good steel, and I suspect you would have some difficulty in finding a Meccan who could explain the derivation of the word or tell when it was introduced. There are many other words of the same kind current. The term anglais is applied to all wares of well-known or evidently good material, without any reference to the place they were made, the merchants themselves, either by courtesy or from ignorance. It is difficult to say which, sometimes, calling all European manufactures Egyptian or Turkish, utterly oblivious to glaring Manchester or London brands and labels, and a Badawi will pronounce an article to be Francais or Anglais at a glance, without in the least knowing the proper significance of the terms. About 11 a.m. we reached the plain of Arafat, a large sandy open, appearing to be somewhat below the level of the approach, and occupying an area of some 4 or 5 square miles. In the northeast of the plain is Mount Arafat, a small hill, about 200 feet high, composed of large masses of grey granite, at the base of quite a respectable little mountain, the Mount of Mercy. We pitched our tents, one for the Amir and men, another for the Begum and women, about 1/3 of a mile south of this hill. As soon as this work was completed, I took good bearings, marked the tents well, and went off alone to the top of Mount Arafat. The scene from here was. I shall not be surprised if it flits across my mind on my deathbed. The depression of the plain gives an amphitheatre-like appearance, and you could almost believe yourself on the stage of some mighty theatre, miles of audience before you, and the sombre scenery of the black Mount of Mercy behind you. What a time and place for a sermon! We had all come out into the wilderness to hear a sermon on this day, and I had determined to hear it, so sat down on the hill to wait till noon, when the Lady Venus had told me it would begin. As I looked down on the great throng, a grey rippling sea of black heads and white bodies, extending from the sides of the hill, thickly clothed with men, to 1.5 miles off on the south, and 1/2 mile across, and remembered the distant countries from which they came, and what brought them, it was impossible to help a feeling almost of awe. It set one thinking. Could all this be of no avail, and all this faith be in vain? If so, it was enough to make a man lose faith in everything of the kind. At noon I left my post on the top of the hill and pressed my way about to try and find where the preacher would stand, and see what was to be seen. The practice among the pilgrims seemed to be to come up on the hill, say 1 or 2 prayers, remain 1/4 hour or so, and return to the plain. At noon there was no general call to prayer, the pilgrims praying in parties near their tents and judging the hour for themselves. I said no noonday prayer myself, but spent the afternoon looking about on Mount Arafat. On the top there is a small colonnade, an obelisk about 15 feet high, and some low stone walls, separating one little irregularity of the surface of the rock from another. Inside and outside these enclosures, and, in fact, all over the hill, the crowd was so great that it was very difficult to get from one place to another, even by climbing walls and jumping from rock to rock. On the sides of the hill are a number of platforms, built up or hewn out of the rock, and a winding road, cut from the bottom to the top, much of which is composed of steps in the rock. At the bottom of the hill is a gravel terrace forming a road between the hill and a large reservoir of water at its base, and there is another of these built tanks, as they are called in India, about 100 yards south of the first. The sides of both these tanks were occupied the whole day by pilgrims performing the lesser ablution. I only saw one man enter the water bodily, and he slipped off the stone edge, I think, as I noticed those near him laughing. Though I stayed on or about the hill until nearly time for afternoon prayer, I heard no sermon, saw no preacher, unless a very old and dirty Arab, not in pilgrim's garb, sitting with his legs across the top of a 6-foot wall, haranguing the crowd in a voice that could not be heard 10 yards off, was the orator we had all come so far to hear, but this I doubt. The probability is, seeing the crowd and noise was so great, the Mufti and his sermon escaped me, more especially as I did not risk inquiring of strangers whom I did not know and who might be anybody short of our special correspondent, even in the Hijaz nowadays. As the afternoon wore on, the press on the hill became greater, the crowd so dense as to literally bear you up, and those on the top had the greatest difficulty in forcing their way down. Many women had got on the hill and were being much crushed. Some people were trodden underfoot and forced into the crevasses of the rocks. I managed to battle my way out of it, and began to make for our tents. I had been pushing across the plain for a quarter of an hour or so, and was well out of the thick of the crowd, to where the ground began to be occupied more by tents and hobbled camels, when I was brought up all standing by a confused roaring behind me, and, on looking back, saw all the men taking off their upper pieces of cloth and waving them over their heads, shouting at the same time the names of Allah, Mohammed, and other exclamations. It seemed to begin at a preconcerted signal, whether the afternoon call to prayers or the end of the sermon, I did not know. This shouting would last for a few minutes at its height, then die almost out, and the cloud of waving white cloths almost all subside, then rise again, beginning at Mount Arafat and spreading over the plain. These intervals of great noise and almost silence continued regularly for about half an hour, and then lapsed gradually into roar and tumult. The whole multitude was now worked up to the highest pitch of excitement, individuals expressing the greatest emotion, while some were quite frantic, and the scene had become a perfect pandemonium. There was something eerie, almost horrible, about it to me, an unimpassioned observer. I felt like a sane man among 300,000 lunatics. However, I shouted, flourished my cloth, capered about, and conducted myself like my uncanny mates, till the firing of the Pasha's 2 guns, which was the signal for decamping, reminded me that I had better return to my party. All the tents at once began to be raised and camels moved, completely changing the whole appearance of the great camp in a few minutes. I had much difficulty in finding our people, and only reached them when they were on the point of moving off. They were not at all surprised that I had lost them, and congratulated me on my luck in finding them as I did. All was ready for starting, but the Shia Poundef and Pasha, together with another procession of the same kind from Medina, passed near our camp, so we waited to follow behind them, spending the time firing off all the firearms we had, and sending up rockets. The breechloaders were fired without taking the trouble to remove the balls from the cartridges. The Amir alone expended 50 rounds of ball cartridge, impartially distributed over the thickly peopled plain, but as he fired high and the guns had a long range, I cannot give a return of his killed and wounded, though I have no doubt he winged a great many in remote parts. The 2 field guns, as they were being drawn along, were fired, round after round, as fast as they could be loaded with small charges of loose powder without being sponged. They were laid point blank, and at every discharge cleared a lane through the crowd, which immediately closed up, nobody seeming to be hurt. One fellow repeatedly exploded an old matchlock, with a bend in the barrel that could be distinctly perceived 20 yards off in the dusk. Immense Congreve rockets and coveys of smaller ones rose from all parts of the plain, whose sticks as they fell could not but have hurt someone. For though the fall of a small rocket stick is an indirect wavering flight and so harmless, still I think a 12-foot rocket pole, after a descent of nearly 3,000 feet, might hurt a man, if it did not harpoon him clean. Though I know every man there was living through a succession of narrow escapes, I must say I did not see a single accident. I afterwards heard of a good many who had been privileged to win. When a Mohammedan dies, he is said to win or gain on the field that day. One dead man was carried past me, who was curiously enough said to have been killed by the kick of a camel. That night, we camped about 1.5 miles before we came to Mina, at a place called Muzdalifah, and here we gathered the 63 small stones to be used during the next 3 days stoning the devil stones at Mina. These pet stones ought to be gathered on this spot, and ought to be of a certain size, about that of a buckshot. Some were very particular as to this, and spent the greater part of the night gathering and sorting out such as they supposed to be of the proper size. This site, like every other pilgrim site described, has innumerable minute observances connected with it, which the pilgrim performs more or less punctiliously according to his strictness, and differently according to his knowledge or belief. We spent much of the night praying and listening to a stranger Maulvi giving us a long extempore prayer, in which he prayed literally, that all who profess and call themselves Mohammedans might hold the faith in unity and peace, that the God who conquers by many or by few might give us victory over all our enemies, and much more to the same effect straight from our church service, we responding Amen to every approved sentiment. It was piercingly cold next morning, and about 2 hours before daylight we started for Mina, being among the first of the great mass to get there. I said my morning prayer at Mina, using warm water for the ablution, and went off immediately after to Mecca on a donkey, in company with the boy Jack, as I was anxious to reach the town, which had before been such a scene of fife and bustle, in the deserted state I knew it would then be. There was nothing out of the way in this, and my haste to go before the morning meal was only put down to a little superfluous religious zeal, it being the proper thing to go into Mecca as soon as possible after the pilgrimage, and perform the same rites as on your first arrival at the holy city, discarding the pilgrim's garb. The road to Mecca was not yet thronged by returning pilgrims, and the few who were on foot so early we soon passed on our donkeys, reaching Mecca shortly after sunrise. On the outskirts of the town a few coffee shops had already been opened, and we passed 2 or 3 groups of Badawi and Negroes, but as we came more into the town the streets were entirely deserted, not a living soul to be seen, all the shops being shut up, and the house doors and windows closed. It had a most strategic aspect, after the appearance which I had been accustomed to for months. As we approached the harem we came upon some beggars sitting and lying at the roadside, who had been in extremis or too feeble to join the pilgrimage, such as were alive, for some were actually dead, greeted us most piteously, imploring us for food, and a hungry time they must have had of it. It was not so with the dogs, as they had been making horribly free with the legs of the defunct. I soon got rid of a handkerchief of bread and dates I had brought as a snack for myself, and prolonged the existence of 1 or 2 exhausted wretches. One of these held our donkeys while we went into the harem. I found only a party of 6 Maghribis, who had returned straight from Arafat during the night, and who were the only pilgrims that had been beforehand with me. Some of the Arabs who officiate in the harem, and who had remained behind to change the cover of the Kaaba, which is renewed at this time yearly, were giving the finishing touches to their work. This cover is sent from Cairo, and is supposed to be made there by 700 virgins. After our prayers and tawaf, we did el-sai on our donkeys, which is allowable to the weak, and we easily reconciled it to our consciences, seeing we had made such haste to do it, and might be supposed to be at least very tired. After this we roamed about the dismal streets, letting our animals go as they willed. There was a kind of fascination about the lonely, lifeless lanes and passages lately so thronged, and my companion seemed to share the feeling with me, for he made the original remark, which I quote from him and not anyone else, "It is like a city of the dead." While going along a narrow out-of-the-way passage I had not before been in I came across an object that nearly brought me off my beast. Overhead, projecting straight out over the lane was a large black board, and painted on it in yellow these letters, "Lodgings." "Jarek," I said, "let's go back." I felt as if I had seen a ghost. However, I recovered the shock sufficiently to note the locality for future investigation, and returned thoughtful and meditative along the road, now thronged with returning pilgrims, to our headquarters for the time at Mina. When I got back I was glad to get out of the pilgrim's garb, which I had found very inadequate against the cold of the night and the sun in the day, which struck painfully on my bare-shaven head. Most of our party had gone into Mecca, but returned before noon to purchase and kill the animals, of which every man, who can by any means afford it, should kill at least one on this day, and which the country supplies plentifully for the occasion. This ceremony partakes more of the character of a feast than of a sacrifice. Though all the sheep and goats killed are young males, I do not think even this is essential, but rather a custom resulting from the necessary practice in the country of always preserving females for breeding and milk. I purchased a little black ram for $2 and killed it at home in the usual way, except that the head was carefully turned towards the Kaaba, and saying, "In the name of God the most merciful and charitable," while cutting its throat. There ought to be something soothing to the feelings about this short prayer, which in the mouth of the Mohammedan operator sounds a fervent hissing curse, as all who have heard it know. Besides a good many rams and goats, the Emir had 2 young camels killed to be given to our Badawi followers and the poor. They were killed at the east end of the village, where a level square space of about half an acre had been set aside for butchering, with a deep trench dug round it for the blood. Here the greater number of the pilgrims brought their animals to be killed, as most of the flocks were stationed at that end of the village. The mode of killing the camels was this: the animal was made to kneel down close up to the trench, and its legs were then tied in a position which made it absolutely incapable of moving them. One man then held out the head, and another drew a short knife, like a sailor's sheath knife, round the neck, close up to the shoulders, then a rotation of the head and the neck falls, severed clean from the body. The cutting up is done without moving the carcass, the skin being opened down the center of the back. This work went on actively all through the day. We also on this day got rid of the first 21 of our stones, 7 of them being thrown at each of 3 places in the village. The first place is at the eastern extremity, and is a small obelisk about 9 feet high, with a low circular wall round the base, inside which the stones fall after striking the obelisk. The second is in the middle of the village, like the first, but rather larger. The last is at the west end of the village. This is a high stone wall on the right-hand side of the road looking west, and a particular stone in this is the object to be hit. It was very difficult to get near them on account of the crowd. Many pilgrims less robust than others had to throw their stones from a distance over the heads of those in front, making very wide shots. This rite is to commemorate Abraham stoning the devil at the advice of the angel Gabriel, when tempted by Satan at these 3 places. We repeated this throwing of stones on each of the 2 next days. I estimated that about 3 tons of shingle ballast had been deposited in the receptacles round the bases of the obelisks before I left Mina. These must be cleared out every year, or they would be filled in a couple of pilgrimages. The popular belief is that they are conveyed back to Muzdalifah by angels. Little occurred specially worthy of remark during the rest of our stay in Mina, except that we revelled in butcher's meat, of which hundreds of carcasses were wasted, while gorged vultures could scarcely flounder out of your way, and flies became a great nuisance. Water was very dear, having to be brought some distance to the village.